There's a story that goes around in estate planning circles, true story, about a man who spent 40 years building a small business, raised 3 kids, paid off the house, and left behind what looked like a solid life. When he died, his family found 17 accounts at 6 different banks, 3 life insurance policies nobody knew about, and a storage unit full of his wife's belongings from a first marriage he'd never once mentioned. The kids spent 2 years and a lot of money sorting it out. They barely spoke to each other by the end. He wasn't a bad man. He was just a quiet one. And here's the thing. Most of us are quieter than we think we are. Not secretive, just private. We grew up in a time when you handled your own business. You didn't burden people. You figured it out. You didn't sit around the dinner table talking about what happens when you die or what you'd want if you ended up in a hospital room unable to speak for yourself. That wasn't the done thing. It still isn't for a lot of people. But the cost of that silence is real, and it lands hardest on the people you love most. Here's what actually happens when families don't have these conversations. They make decisions in crisis. They guess. They fight. They go to court. They hire lawyers to argue about things you could have cleared up in an afternoon over coffee. Or they don't fight. They just quietly resent each other for the rest of their lives, each one convinced they knew what you would have wanted, none of them able to prove it. You're probably somewhere between 50 and 70 right now. Maybe you've already lost a parent and you watched your family go through some version of that scramble. Maybe you swore you'd handle things differently. Or maybe you're just starting to feel that low-level hum. Not fear exactly, more like awareness. That time has a different texture than it used to. That there are things you should probably say, and you keep meaning to, but the moment never quite arrives on its own. The moment doesn't arrive on its own. You have to make it. So let's talk about what those conversations actually are. Not the legal documents. You need those too, but that's not what this is about. This is about the talking, the actual words between actual people, before those people are sitting in a waiting room somewhere, trying to remember what you would have wanted. The first conversation almost nobody has is the one about your medical wishes. And I don't mean, do you have a living will? I mean, does your family actually know what's in it and why? There's a difference. A document in a drawer is not a conversation. It's a piece of paper that may or may not get found, may or may not be read, and may or may not reflect what you were actually thinking when you wrote it. What people need to hear from your mouth is what matters to you. Not in legal language, in plain terms. Do you want every possible intervention if something goes wrong, even if the odds are terrible? Some people do. They want to fight. They want the machines and the procedures and every chance, no matter how slim. That's a completely legitimate position, and your family needs to know it. Or, are you the kind of person who, if you were in a vegetative state with no real chance of recovery, would want to let go? Are you more afraid of a long, diminished life than of death itself? That's also a legitimate position, maybe a more common one than people admit, and your family needs to know that too. Because here's what happens when they don't know. Your daughter, who loves you and cannot stand the thought of losing you, pushes for every intervention. Your son, who also loves you and can't stand the thought of watching you suffer, pushes to let go. And now they're not just grieving, they're fighting about you, about what you would have wanted in a hospital hallway. And there is no good ending to that story. The conversation you need to have isn't morbid. It can actually be kind of freeing once you get past the first few awkward minutes. You're not talking about dying. You're talking about what a good life means to you and where the line is. You're giving the people who love you a gift, the gift of not having to guess. Pick one person, your spouse, your oldest kid, whoever is most likely to be in that room, and say it out loud. If I'm ever in a situation where I can't make decisions for myself, here's what I want. And then tell them, All of it. The version you'd want and the version you wouldn't. What quality of life means to you, specifically. Whether there are conditions under which you'd want them to let go. And then make sure that person is legally designated as your healthcare proxy or medical power of attorney. And make sure they have a copy of whatever documents you've signed. Not just knowledge of their existence, an actual copy, in a place they can find it. While you're at it, and this is one people really skip, talk to that person about the emotional weight of what you're asking them to carry. If you're designating your daughter as the one who gets to make the call, tell her you understand that's a hard thing to ask. Tell her you trust her. Tell her that whatever she decides in that moment, you've already forgiven her for it. Because one of the cruelest things we do to the people we designate is give them the power to make impossible decisions and then leave them alone with the guilt of having made them. Now, let's talk about money. And I know, money is awkward. It's personal. In a lot of American households, nobody ever talked about money at the dinner table. You earned it, you spent it, you saved what you could, and you didn't advertise the specifics. But here's the problem with that. Your adult children probably have a completely wrong idea of your financial situation. Either they think you have more than you do, or they think you have less. Either they're quietly planning to inherit something that may not exist, or they're worried about you unnecessarily. Or they have no idea that there's a storage unit with a locked box and a password for an account at a bank 3 states away. You don't have to show your kids your tax returns. You don't have to tell them your net worth down to the dollar. But they need to know enough to help you if something happens. And they need to know enough to not be blindsided. At minimum, someone who loves you needs to know where your important documents are. Not approximately, exactly. The will, the insurance policies, the retirement account statements, the deed to the house, the passwords, every financial account with the name of the institution and the account number written down somewhere your people can find. This is not sexy information. It is also not optional. And while you're at it, do you have a will? An actual, currently valid will? Because I've been meaning to is not a will. And dying without one, what lawyers call dying intestate, means the state you live in decides what happens to your stuff, and their formula is a generic one that has nothing to do with your actual family, your actual wishes, or the specific situation of the people you love. Your estranged brother might end up with something. Your daughter, who took care of you for the last 5 years, might get exactly the same share as the son who hasn't called in 3. Because that's how the law works when you don't have a document that says otherwise. Now here's where it gets a little more personal and a little more important. There are things your children don't know about you. I don't mean secrets necessarily, although everyone has some version of those. I mean the story of your life that you've never quite gotten around to telling. The things that shaped you, the choices you made and why, the parts of your past you're proud of, and the parts you're not. At some point, maybe soon, maybe not yet, your kids are going to want to know those things. And eventually you won't be there to tell them. And that loss, the loss of the story, is a different kind of loss, but it's a real one. I'm not saying you owe your children your entire biography. I'm saying there are probably things you know about your parents, about your childhood, about what it was like to be young in the era you were young in, that will disappear if you don't find a way to pass them on. Not because they're necessarily dramatic, but because they're yours, because they explain you, because your grandchildren or great-grandchildren might someday want to understand where they came from. This doesn't have to be formal. It can be as simple as an afternoon where you let your kid ask you questions, or a voice memo on your phone, or letters you write to your grandchildren and tuck away to be opened later. The medium doesn't matter. The information does. And while you're having this kind of conversation, the "what makes me who I am" conversation. This is also the time to say things you might have left unsaid. If there's someone in your family you have a strained relationship with, and you've always thought there'd be time to repair it, or that they'd figure out you loved them without you having to actually say it, I'd encourage you to reconsider. The window for that kind of repair is not infinite, and people carry the weight of unresolved relationships with their parents for the rest of their lives. It doesn't have to be a dramatic reconciliation. Sometimes it's just saying, "Here's what I should have said. Here's what I actually feel. Here's where I fell short, and I know it." That kind of conversation might be the most uncomfortable one on this list. It also might be the one that matters most. Let me come at the caregiving conversation from a slightly different angle, because I think most people misunderstand what it's actually about. When families don't talk about aging and care before there's a crisis, what happens is that decisions get made reactively. Mom falls. Dad has a small stroke. There's an emergency, a hospitalization, a discharge, and suddenly someone is trying to figure out what happens next in 48 hours. That's when people make bad decisions. Not because they're bad people, but because they're scared and rushed and operating without information. The conversation you want to have, while everyone's healthy and calm, is, what does getting older look like in this family? That sounds vague, so let me sharpen it. Do you want to stay in your house as long as possible, even if it means modifications and help? Or would you actually prefer a community of some kind, somewhere with people around, activities, less maintenance? Do you have feelings about assisted living, nursing homes? Have you thought about what would make you feel like you still had dignity and autonomy versus what would make you feel like you'd lost yourself? Because here's what happens when you don't say any of this. Your kids assume. And your kids will almost certainly assume that you want to stay home at all costs because they know you love your house and they don't want to feel like they're pushing you somewhere. But maybe that's not actually what you want. Maybe you've thought about it and realized that being somewhere with other people and some structure sounds better than being alone in a house that gets harder to manage every year. But if you don't say that, nobody knows. And nobody's going to suggest it, because suggesting it feels like abandonment. This is a conversation where you need to be honest about what you actually want, not what you think you're supposed to want. And if you do want to stay home, and lots of people do, legitimately, then you need to talk honestly about what that means. Who is going to help? What does that help look like? What are you willing to accept, and what crosses a line for you? Are you planning to hire people? And do you have a sense of what that costs? Because in-home care is expensive in a way that surprises a lot of people. We're talking potentially $25 to $35 an hour in many parts of the country, and the math adds up fast. Your kids need to know what you're expecting of them, if anything, because the dynamic in families where one child ends up as the primary caregiver without that ever having been discussed or agreed to is almost always painful. The caregiver burns out. The other siblings feel guilty, but also feel a little let off the hook. Nobody's happy, and nobody's talking about why. That scenario is not inevitable, but avoiding it requires a conversation that most families never have. If there are multiple kids in your family, this is the conversation where you talk, openly, out loud, about what you're expecting from each of them and what you're not. You don't have to divide it up like a business proposal, but you do have to acknowledge that it's a conversation worth having, that there's no fair way to handle it that doesn't involve talking about it. One more thing, because I think it's important and it almost never comes up in these kinds of discussions. Talk to your family about your finances, not just in terms of what you have, but in terms of what you're worried about. A lot of people in their 50s and 60s carry a quiet, low-grade anxiety about money that they've never put into words for anyone. They're not sure their savings will last. They're worried about healthcare costs. They're not sure if they'll be able to stay in their home on a fixed income. They lie awake at 3 a.m. doing math that doesn't quite add up, and they don't tell their kids because it feels like failure, because they don't want to worry them, because they grew up in a culture that said you handle your own problems. But here's what I want to offer as a counter to that. Your adult children, most of them, would rather know. They would rather have an honest conversation about where things actually stand than find out later that you were struggling and didn't say anything. Not because they're going to fix it necessarily, or because you should become dependent on them, but because real relationships are built on real information. And because there may be options or ideas or resources that none of you know about because you've never compared notes. The silence isn't protection, it's just distance. There's a version of this conversation that a lot of families stumble into eventually, usually around a kitchen table at Thanksgiving when something's happened. A scare, a diagnosis, a loss in the extended family, and suddenly everybody's saying things they should have said years ago. And you know what? Those conversations, even when they happen late, even when they're imperfect and a little messy and someone cries, they matter. They land. The only difference between having that conversation then and having it now is the crisis in the middle. You can skip the crisis. You can sit down with the people you love, not in a formal, agenda-driven, document-signing kind of way, but just as yourself, and say, "There are some things I want us to talk about while I can." And then you talk. You say what you want. You ask what they're worried about. You find out what assumptions they're carrying that might not be right. You clear some things up. You maybe say something you've been meaning to say for a long time. It's not a one-time event. It's an ongoing thing. You have a conversation today, and 6 months from now, something changes. A health situation, a financial situation, a shift in what you want, and you update it. You keep talking. That's what families that navigate this stuff well actually do. Not perfectly, but openly. The people who've watched their parents go through this without any preparation, who've sat in hospitals making decisions with no guidance, who've cleaned out houses with no idea what was important and what wasn't, who've handled estates and fights and questions that will never get answered. They will tell you, almost to a person, that what they wanted most was just to have known, to have had the conversation, to have had the chance to ask and be answered. You still have that chance. Most of the people who needed it most never knew they were running out of time. So pick the conversation that feels most overdue, not the whole list, just one, and find the moment this week or this month to actually have it. Not perfectly, just honestly, with someone who deserves to know what you know about your own life, your own wishes, your own fears. That's the whole thing, really. Not documents, not plans, not checklists. Just you, being willing to be known, fully, honestly, while there's still time to matter.